Go ahead, read it twice. It's not going to change what it says. You had a good run, Diane.
Warren Hartwell raised his glass at the palm room and told the table he was about to become the luckiest divorced man in Texas. 22 years of marriage, dissolved by 9 o'clock the next morning, and Diane wouldn't see a dime past what the prenup allowed, which by his own design was next to nothing. He called her sweet. He called her simple. He said she'd spent 2 decades organizing his receipts and calling it a career, and now she could go back to whatever it was women like her did when the check stopped. His lawyer laughed along. His friends laughed along. Nobody at that table had ever once asked Diane Hartwell what she did on Tuesday nights, where she went for 6 years with a canvas tote bag and a thermos, or why she kept a framed certificate in a closet instead of on a wall. Warren certainly hadn't asked. He was about to find out in front of a judge, and by the time he understood the full shape of what he hadn't asked, it would already be too late to matter. Warren was 51, built like a man who still thought of himself as the high school linebacker he'd been 30 years earlier, with a tan that came from a bulb and a laugh that came from nowhere in particular. He was the founder and CEO of Hartwell Realty and Logistics, a Houston-based firm that had grown from a single strip mall office into a regional empire of warehouses, storage facilities, and commercial leasing across 3 states. He liked to tell people he'd built it with his bare hands, that he'd slept in his truck the first 2 years, that nobody had ever handed him anything. What he left out always was the woman sitting across from him at the anniversary dinners, nodding along, saying nothing, who had been there since before the first warehouse, since before the first loan, since before there was anything to build at all. Diane had married Warren at 29, a paralegal at a small downtown firm who'd caught his eye at a real estate closing where she'd corrected an error in the title documents that his own attorney had missed. He'd found that charming at the time, the sharpness of her, though it was a quality he would spend the next 2 decades quietly, methodically discouraging. He liked that she was thoughtful before she was outspoken. He liked, more than he ever admitted, that she made him look smarter in rooms where he was. He told his buddies once, within her earshot, that he needed a wife who wouldn't compete with him, and Diane had smiled and refilled his glass and said nothing, because saying nothing had become, over the years, its own kind of armor, a survival skill she'd built one silence at a time until it fit her like a second skin. She had given up her paralegal job the year they married, at his insistence, so she could focus on the home and the growing business. What that meant in practice was that Diane became the unofficial, unpaid, unrecognized backbone of Hartwell Realty and Logistics. She reconciled the books on Sunday nights while Warren watched football, correcting the mistakes his bookkeeper made and never mentioning it to either of them. She caught the invoicing error in year 3 that would have cost him a $200,000 contract with a regional grocery distributor, an error she found at 11 at night after putting their daughter to bed, and which she fixed quietly before Warren even woke up the next morning. She wrote half his emails to lenders because his own, by his own frequent admission, were not his strong suit, and she learned, slowly, the particular vocabulary bankers wanted to hear, the phrasing that made risk sound like opportunity. Warren took the credit for all of it, every single time, standing at podiums and accepting small business awards from the Houston Chamber of Commerce, while Diane sat in the audience in a dress he'd approved, clapping for a version of the story that had quietly erased her from it. For the first several years, Diane told herself this was simply what partnership looked like in a traditional marriage, that some couples divided labor this way, and there was no shame in it, that Warren's success was, in some diffuse and unspoken sense, hers too. She believed this the way people believe things they need to believe in order to keep waking up in the same bed every morning. She had a daughter, Emily, born in their 4th year of marriage, and for a long stretch after that, survival simply meant getting through each day, and there was no room in her head for questions about whether the arrangement was fair. It was only later, Once Emily was old enough for school and the long, quiet hours of the afternoon opened up again, that Diane began to notice the shape of the cage she'd been living in. Gently, one bar at a time. The way a person notices a room has grown smaller only after they've been sitting in it for years. The turn came quietly, the way most important things in Diane's life had come to happen quietly. It was 9 years into the marriage, a Tuesday afternoon, and Diane was sitting in the waiting room of a downtown law office while Warren finalized a lease dispute with an attorney named Harold Voss, a sharp, unassuming man Warren had hired on a friend's recommendation. She watched Voss work through the glass wall of the conference room. She watched him ask precise questions, watched him find the loophole in the opposing counsel's argument that Warren's own people had missed entirely, watched the calm, surgical authority of a person who understood exactly how the machine worked and exactly how to make it move in the direction he wanted. Diane had spent 9 years being told, in ways large and small, that she wasn't cut out to understand contracts, that this was Warren's world and she was a visitor in it. Watching Harold Voss work, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a small, sharp flicker of recognition, the sense that she was looking at a version of competence she recognized in herself and had simply never been permitted to use. She went home that night, and once Emily was asleep and Warren was out at what he called a client dinner, opened a box in the garage she hadn't touched since her wedding, a box of her old paralegal textbooks, contract law outlines, and civil procedure notes from a certificate program she'd completed at 22. She sat on the concrete floor of the garage under a bare bulb and read until nearly 2 in the morning, and something in her chest that had gone quiet for almost a decade began, very slowly, to wake back up. She didn't tell Warren. She told herself at first that it was a private project, something to occupy the hours he was never home, nothing more serious than a hobby a bored housewife might take up to pass the time. She enrolled in an online paralegal refresher course under a slightly altered version of her name, Diane Voss instead of Diane Hartwell, using her mother's maiden name so that nothing would surface if Warren ever happened to glance at a credit card statement, paid for out of a grocery budget she'd quietly padded for years. A budget Warren never checked because checking would have meant admitting he didn't actually know what things cost in his own household. The refresher course led, within a year, to an LSAT prep book she kept hidden inside a decorating magazine on her nightstand. The LSAT prep book led, 3 years later, to a night law program at a satellite campus 45 minutes outside the city, 4 nights a week, a program chosen specifically because it was unglamorous and unremarkable enough that no one Warren knew would ever set foot there. She told him it was book club. She told him it was a women's charity board she joined to keep herself occupied. She told him whatever kept his attention moving past her and back onto himself, which, she had learned over 9 years of marriage, took very little effort at all, because Warren Hartwell had never once, in all that time, asked her a genuine question about her inner life and actually waited to hear the answer. For 6 years, Diane Hartwell lived 2 lives running parallel to each other like train tracks that never touched. In one, she was Warren's decorative, dismissible wife, the woman he introduced at galas as his better half, though don't tell her he said that, before turning immediately to talk business with someone he considered more interesting. In the other, she sat in the back row of a night classroom, a woman in her 40s surrounded mostly by students half her age, taking notes on civil procedure and contract law, and eventually choosing forensic accounting as a specialty, a choice she made deliberately, because somewhere in year 3 of law school she had started noticing things in Warren's business that troubled her in a way she couldn't quite name yet. Numbers that moved in ways they shouldn't. Contracts renewed at terms that made no sense unless someone somewhere was being paid to look the other way. Maintenance line items that appeared and disappeared from quarter to quarter with no corresponding work order behind them. She kept a private notebook, not out of malice at first, but out of the habit any careful accountant develops of writing down what doesn't add up, a habit that would, years later, matter far more than she could have imagined on the night she started it. She was not without allies in those years, though she kept them carefully compartmentalized, the way she kept everything else. There was Renata Cole, a classmate 20 years younger, a single mother finishing her own law degree at night while working days as a paralegal, who sat next to Diane in 3 separate courses and slowly became the only person in the world who knew the full truth of what Diane was doing and why. It was Renata who first suggested, gently, over coffee after a contract's final, that Diane's habit of tracking anomalies in her husband's business ledgers sounded less like idle curiosity and more like the early architecture of a case. Diane had laughed the suggestion off at the time, uncomfortable with the idea, unwilling yet to look directly at what she suspected. But she kept the notebook. She kept adding to it. And Renata Cole, without ever quite saying so out loud, became the person Diane trusted to know where that notebook was, in case anything ever happened to her. Diane passed the bar exam 3 months before her 52nd birthday, on her second attempt, the first having been derailed by a family emergency involving her mother's declining health that she'd navigated entirely alone, driving 2 hours each way to a hospital in Beaumont on weekends, while telling Warren she was visiting an old college friend. She did not celebrate the bar results with Warren, because Warren did not know. She celebrated alone in her car, in the parking garage of the courthouse where the results had been posted, crying the kind of tears that come from 20 years of being told she was nothing, finally proven wrong by a piece of paper only she and Renata had seen. She called Renata from that parking garage, and the 2 women cried together over the phone, 2 decades and 2 very different lives apart, bound by the strange, private triumph of a secret nobody else would ever fully understand the weight of. She framed the bar certificate. She put it in the back of her closet, behind a rack of the modest, unremarkable clothes Warren preferred she wear, because she still wasn't sure, even then, what she was going to do with it, or whether she would ever do anything with it at all. She found out what she was going to do with it 4 months later. On the morning, Warren handed her divorce papers over breakfast and told her, almost cheerfully, that he'd already spoken to his attorney, that the prenup she'd signed at 29 was airtight, that she'd be walking away with $60,000 and whatever furniture she could fit in a rental truck. He told her she should be grateful he wasn't contesting the car. He told her, with the same easy cruelty he'd used for 2 decades without ever quite registering it as cruelty, that she'd had a good run, that she was still presentable for her age, that some other man, some accountant or schoolteacher, would probably take her on. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd already started seeing someone, a 34-year-old marketing director named Kayla who worked at a firm Hartwell Realty contracted with, and that he was looking forward to what he called a fresh chapter. Diane set down her coffee cup. She asked him, very calmly, if he was certain that was how he wanted to proceed. Warren laughed and said he'd never been more certain of anything in his life. And Diane, for the first time in 22 years, let herself feel something other than the reflexive urge to smooth things over. Warren spent the 6 weeks before the hearing exactly the way he'd spent the 6 weeks before every triumph in his adult life, loudly. He hosted a celebration dinner at the Palm Room 2 nights before the court date, told the table the marriage had been a good investment with a clean exit, and toasted to freedom while his attorney, a sharp-suited litigator named Grant Ashby, nodded along and assured everyone the paperwork was a formality. Grant had run a background check on Diane's side, standard practice, and found nothing of concern. No attorney of record filed. No name changes on public record under Diane Hartwell. No business filings under her own name. What Grant's search had missed, because he had never thought to look for it, was a bar admission filed 11 months earlier under Diane Voss, a name that existed nowhere in Warren's household paperwork, and had no reason to appear in a routine background check on a woman he assumed had spent 2 decades doing nothing more consequential than hosting dinner parties. As far as the public record Grant checked was concerned, Diane Hartwell was exactly what Warren had always called her, a homemaker with a closet full of cardigans and no fight in her at all. Warren found this hilarious. He told his friends at the Palm Room that she'd probably show up alone, maybe crying, and that he almost felt bad about it. Almost. Kayla, the marketing director, was at the dinner too, seated close to Warren, laughing at his jokes with the particular brightness of someone still in the early, uncomplicated phase of a relationship built on someone else's collapse. She asked Warren at one point during dinner whether Diane had ever worked, whether she'd have anything to fall back on. Warren waved the question away. "She'll figure something out," he said. "She always does." It was, though neither of them recognized it in the moment, the single truest sentence he would say all night. The morning of the hearing, Warren arrived at the Harris County Courthouse in a car service, flanked by Grant Ashby and two paralegals carrying binders neither of them would end up needing to open. He mentioned the hearing offhand to a business reporter he golfed with, a young man named Chris Doyle at the Houston business desk, wanting a witness to what he was certain would be the cleanest, most decisive divorce settlement of his career, the kind of story that made a man look sharp rather than cruel. He checked his watch at the elevator bank, irritated that it was 8:52 and Diane hadn't arrived, already composing in his head the story he'd tell about how she'd been too ashamed to even show up on time. When the elevator doors finally opened on the 9th floor, Diane stepped out first, alone, and Warren's prepared story died in his throat before he'd even had the chance to tell it. She wore a navy suit he didn't recognize, tailored close, nothing like the soft, forgettable clothes he'd steered her toward for 2 decades. She carried a single leather folio instead of a purse. She walked past him without a glance, her heels even and unhurried on the marble floor, straight to the door of courtroom 6C, where she sat down at the defendant's table, opened the folio, and began arranging her own exhibits with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this before, or at the very least, someone who had imagined doing this 1,000 times in the quiet hours of 100 nights nobody else knew about. "Where's your lawyer?" Warren asked, loud enough that a passing bailiff turned his head. Diane didn't look up. "You're looking at her," she said. Warren laughed, the same dismissive laugh he'd used on her for 22 years, and turned to Grant expecting him to laugh along. Grant Ashby wasn't laughing. He was staring at the Bar Association pin on the lapel of her jacket, small and easy to miss unless you knew exactly what it meant, and his face had gone very still. Judge Patricia Alvarez took the bench at 9 sharp, a no-nonsense jurist known throughout Harris County for running the tightest, fastest docket in the building, and for a particular impatience with theatrics of any kind. She read the case name, confirmed both parties were present, and asked Grant Ashby to proceed on his motion for summary judgment. Grant, recovering his composure, launched into the argument he'd rehearsed a dozen times. A valid, fully executed prenuptial agreement, independent counsel at signing, a clean and enforceable separation of assets, nothing left to litigate but the paperwork. He handed the agreement to the clerk with the easy confidence of a man who had never lost a case he considered a formality. Judge Alvarez took the document, began paging through it, and then turned to the defendant's table. "And for the record," she said, "will the defendant be represented by counsel today, or is she proceeding on her own?" Diane rose. "Diane Hartwell, appearing on my own behalf, Your Honor, admitted under the name Diane Voss. Texas Bar number 24,118,906. The room went quiet in the particular way courtrooms go quiet when something has shifted that most of the people in it don't yet understand. Grant Ashby's jaw tightened. He'd run the wrong search. He'd checked for a filed attorney of record representing her. He'd never once checked whether the woman across the table held a license of her own, under a name that had no obvious connection to the one on the marriage certificate. Warren, still not understanding, leaned toward Grant and whispered, "What's she talking about? A bar number? Is that a joke?" Grant did not answer him. Judge Alvarez, unmoved, simply noted the appearance for the record and told Grant to continue. Grant continued, though his voice had lost some of its earlier polish, finishing his argument for enforcement of the prenuptial agreement as written. When it was Diane's turn, she stood, opened her folio, and spoke without notes, her voice steadier than it had any right to be given how many years she had waited to use it in exactly this room, in exactly this way. Your Honor, we do not contest the validity of the prenuptial agreement or the signature on it. What we contest is the characterization of the marital estate my husband is asking this court to enforce. She placed a document on the clerk's desk. This is a forensic accounting summary of Hartwell Realty and Logistics covering the last 11 years, prepared by a licensed examiner and supported by internal financial records I maintained personally, in my capacity as the company's unofficial, and I would argue de facto, controller for the better part of 2 decades. Warren's face had gone from confusion to something colder. "That's not real," he said, loud enough to draw a warning glance from the bench. "She doesn't have access to those records. She's never worked a day in her life." Judge Alvarez raised a hand for quiet and asked Diane to continue. "Your Honor, the prenuptial agreement I signed at 29 protects Mr. Hartwell's premarital assets and any assets acquired solely through his individual efforts during the marriage. What it does not protect, under Texas community property law, is value created through the direct labor and professional contribution of the other spouse, undisclosed and uncompensated, over the life of the marriage. I have 11 years of internal ledgers, reconciliation notes, and correspondence, much of it in my own handwriting, establishing that I performed the substantive financial control function of this company without salary, without title, and without acknowledgement. That labor has a market value. Under the reimbursement doctrine this court is well familiar with, the community estate is entitled to reimbursement for the value of that uncompensated labor, calculated against comparable executive compensation for a controller of a firm this size." She placed a second document on the desk. "That value, conservatively calculated by a licensed forensic examiner, exceeds $11 million. Warren stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "This is insane," he said. "She kept the books because I let her help. She wasn't an employee. She's my wife." Judge Alvarez's expression did not change. "Mr. Hartwell, please sit down or I will have the bailiff assist you." Warren sat, jaw working, staring at Diane like he was seeing her for the first time, which, in the way that mattered, he was. Grant Ashby leaned over and whispered something urgent in his ear, and whatever it was drained the last of the color from Warren's face. He had just realized, 3 minutes too late, that the woman he'd spent 2 decades calling simple had spent those same 2 decades quietly documenting exactly how the company worked, exactly where the money went, and exactly what it would cost him the day he underestimated her one time too many. Grant Ashby asked for a 10-minute recess before Diane could enter her third exhibit into the record, and Judge Alvarez granted it, though not without a pointed look at the clock. In the hallway outside 6C, Warren grabbed Grant's arm hard enough that the attorney had to shake him off. "Fix this," Warren said, his voice cracking in a way it never had in 20 years of boardrooms. "You told me this was airtight. You told me she had nothing." Grant pulled him toward the empty consultation room at the end of the hall, closed the door, and turned on him with none of the deference he'd shown for 3 years of billing Warren's retainer. "I told you the prenup was airtight against a spouse with no legal standing and no evidence," Grant said. "I did not know your wife was a licensed attorney with 11 years of your company's internal financial records. That is not a hole in my strategy, Warren. That is a hole you left open for 6 years without telling anyone, including me." Warren sank into a chair, staring at his hands, and for the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely nothing to say. Grant tried in the 10 remaining minutes to salvage what he could. He suggested they offer Diane a revised settlement on the spot, something well above the $60,000, enough to make her third exhibit unnecessary, enough to keep whatever was in that folio out of the public record entirely. Warren, still reeling, agreed to anything, said he'd pay her $1 million if it made this stop, if it kept his name out of the business press by lunchtime. Grant went to find Diane in the hallway and made the offer, carefully, professionally, the way a man makes an offer when he already suspects it won't be enough. Diane listened without expression, standing near the window at the end of the hallway with the folio held against her chest. When he finished, she said only that she'd consider it once the third exhibit was entered, and walked back into the courtroom, and Grant understood then that this had stopped being a negotiation. It had become a reckoning, and reckonings, unlike negotiations, do not stop for money. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. When the recess ended, Diane entered her third exhibit, and this was the one that changed the shape of the room entirely. It was not a claim for reimbursement. It was a report. Over her 11 years quietly managing the company's internal ledgers, Diane had noticed, and eventually documented in exacting detail, a pattern of falsified maintenance records across 9 of Hartwell Realty and Logistics' warehouse properties. Fire suppression inspections that had never been performed but were signed off as complete. Structural safety certifications renewed on paper by an inspector, a man named Delbert Cranston, who, records showed, had not physically visited 3 of the properties in over 4 years despite billing for annual inspections each of those years. Warren had been quietly diverting the maintenance and safety compliance budget into a separate account for years, an account Diane had first noticed as an anomaly in year 6 of her secret education, then tracked, then eventually understood in full once her forensic accounting coursework gave her the vocabulary to name what she was looking at. She had never gone to the authorities. She told the court plainly that for years she had believed exposing it would destroy the only stable thing in her children's lives, and so she had simply kept records, waiting, hoping it would never matter, hoping he would eventually correct it himself. He never had. Judge Alvarez asked Diane directly whether she was alleging criminal conduct, and Diane said that under Texas Occupations Code and applicable fire and building safety statutes, falsifying inspection and safety compliance records on commercial properties constituted a criminal offense, and that as an officer of the court, she had an obligation to disclose evidence of ongoing public safety fraud once it became relevant to a proceeding before the bench. She was not asking the court to rule on criminal liability. She was informing the court, for the record, that this evidence existed, and that she intended to forward it to the Texas State Fire Marshal's office and the relevant county building safety authority, regardless of the outcome of the divorce, because 3 of the warehouses in question currently housed subcontracted overnight staff, and she had lost the ability to sit on this information the moment it stopped being only her problem and started being a matter of other people's safety. Warren's face had gone the color of the marble floor. Grant Ashby did not stand to object. He simply sat, staring at the exhibit number on the document Diane had entered, understanding with total clarity that whatever billing relationship he had with Warren Hartwell was now a professional liability rather than an asset, and that his own license could be at risk if he was seen to have had any knowledge of falsified safety records and failed to act. He leaned toward Warren one final time. "I have to withdraw," he whispered. "I can't be in this room for what happens next." Warren grabbed his sleeve, hissed that he was paying him, that he couldn't just leave, and Grant quietly, firmly, told him that continuing to represent a client actively implicated in concealing falsified fire and structural safety records was not something his malpractice insurance covered, and stood, and asked Judge Alvarez for permission to withdraw as counsel of record. The judge granted it without hesitation, and Warren watched the only ally he had left in the room pack a briefcase and walk out through the same double doors Diane had walked through hours earlier, though for entirely different reasons. Judge Alvarez called a formal recess of 20 minutes to review the exhibits in full, and it was during this recess that the story began to move beyond the walls of courtroom 6C entirely. Chris Doyle, the business reporter Warren had personally invited that morning expecting a flattering item about a clean, decisive divorce, had stayed through the entire proceeding, initially bored, then increasingly riveted, taking notes he'd never expected to need. He stepped into the hallway during the recess and made 2 phone calls, one to his editor and one to a contact at the Texas State Fire Marshal's Public Information Office, confirming that no complaint yet existed on file regarding the properties named in open court, which meant, as far as Chris Doyle was concerned, that he had found himself sitting in the middle of the biggest story of his young career purely by accident, invited there by the very man the story was about to destroy. When Judge Alvarez returned to the bench, she spoke without preamble, and the courtroom, which had spent the morning slowly filling with a handful of additional spectators drawn by whispers in the hallway, went completely silent to hear her. The court finds the forensic accounting evidence credible and sufficiently documented to support a claim for reimbursement of uncompensated professional labor under Texas community property law. The court further finds that the evidence regarding falsified safety inspection records, while outside the scope of this proceeding's ultimate ruling on the marital estate, constitutes a matter this court is obligated to refer, as required by law, to the Texas State Fire Marshal's Office and the Harris County Building Safety Division for independent investigation, effective immediately. Judgment is granted in favor of the defendant, Diane Hartwell, in the amount of $11.4 million, representing the reimbursed value of uncompensated professional labor over the course of the marriage, to be satisfied from the marital estate prior to any further division of assets under the existing prenuptial agreement. Mr. Hartwell, you are ordered to comply with full financial disclosure to a court-appointed receiver within 30 days, and you are advised that obstruction of the pending safety investigation referenced in this record will be treated as a separate matter subject to separate consequences. Warren did not speak. He sat perfectly still, alone at the plaintiff's table with no attorney beside him, staring at the judgment as it was read into the record, and when the gavel came down, he flinched like it had physically struck him. Diane closed her folio, gathered her things, and walked out of courtroom 6C the same way she had walked in, unhurried, composed, the navy suit and the leather folio and 20 years of quiet finally announcing themselves in a language even Warren Hartwell could understand, though understanding it and accepting it, he would learn over the following months, were 2 very different things. In the hallway, Chris Doyle approached Diane and asked, carefully, whether she'd be willing to comment for a story he now intended to write regardless of what she said. Diane paused, considered the question for longer than most people would have, and said only that she had spent a long time being underestimated, and that it had turned out to be the most useful education she'd ever received. She declined to say more, told him she'd rather let the fire marshal's investigation speak for itself, and walked toward the elevator bank, where Renata Cole was waiting, having taken the morning off from her own paralegal job to be there in person for the first time either of them had allowed the 2 halves of Diane's life to occupy the same room. The 2 women embraced without speaking, and it was, though neither said so at the time, the first moment in 6 years that Diane's 2 lives had finally become one. The State Fire Marshal's investigation, launched within the week and covered extensively by Chris Doyle's paper, once his editor understood the scope of what had happened in courtroom 6C, confirmed everything in Diane's exhibit, and found additional falsified records across 2 more properties Diane hadn't even had full visibility into. Delbert Cranston, the inspector who had signed off on inspections he'd never performed, lost his state certification within a month and faced his own separate criminal referral for fraud. Hartwell Realty and Logistics was placed under a consent decree requiring full third-party safety recertification of every property in its portfolio, at Warren's expense, before any building could remain occupied, a process that displaced overnight subcontracted staff at 3 facilities for several weeks while emergency inspections were completed, a hardship Diane felt the full weight of even as she understood it had been unavoidable, and she personally arranged, through her new small practice, pro bono assistance for several of the displaced workers navigating unemployment paperwork during the gap. The financial cost of the recertification, combined with the $11.4 million judgment and the reputational collapse that followed the local news coverage, forced Warren to sell his controlling stake in the company within 8 months, at a price far below what it would have commanded a year earlier. The buyer, a regional logistics group that had been trying to acquire Hartwell for years, brought in new management within weeks, and one of the first calls the new leadership made, out of what they described publicly as due diligence and what Diane privately understood as something closer to poetic justice, was to Diane herself, offering her a consulting retainer to help the new ownership rebuild a compliance and financial controls framework from the ground up. Drawing on the very expertise Warren had spent 2 decades pretending she didn't have, Diane declined the retainer politely, telling them she had other work now, but recommended Renata Cole for the position instead. And Renata, freshly barred herself by then, took the job and built, over the following 2 years, the exact kind of internal safeguard system that might have prevented the entire crisis in the first place had it existed a decade earlier. Warren, no longer CEO of a company that no longer bore any resemblance to the empire he'd bragged about at the Palm Room, moved into a modest rented condo on the outskirts of the city, alone, his phone considerably quieter than it had been a year before. Kayla, the marketing director who had asked at that final celebratory dinner whether Diane would have anything to fall back on, ended things within 3 weeks of the story breaking, telling mutual friends she hadn't signed up to date a man under state investigation. Grant Ashby's firm quietly declined to take on any further matters connected to Warren, and Warren spent several months cycling through a series of increasingly junior attorneys, each one less impressed by his name than the last, as he fought a losing battle against the receiver, appointed to oversee what remained of his finances. Diane used a portion of the settlement to open a small legal practice in a converted storefront near the courthouse, focused on family law and elder financial protection, the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that rarely made headlines but changed the lives of the people who walked through her door, many of them women in circumstances she recognized immediately and intimately. She hired Renata part-time before Renata moved on to the compliance role, and later brought on a young associate of her own, a recent law graduate named Priya Nair who reminded Diane, in small ways, of the woman she herself had been at the very beginning of her secret education, hungry and unsure and quietly certain there was more to her than anyone around her currently believed. Diane kept the framed bar certificate on the wall of her new office this time, not in a closet, in plain view above her desk, where anyone who sat across from her could see exactly how long she had waited, and exactly what she had done with the years everyone assumed had been wasted. She still went out on Tuesday nights, though now it really was book club, the first entirely honest Tuesday night of her adult life, and Renata still came, most weeks, the two of them picking books neither of them had time to fully read and talking mostly about work instead, which suited them both fine. Emily, Diane and Warren's daughter, 20 at the time of the hearing and away at college, had learned about the divorce and the trial the same week as everyone else, through a mix of her father's evasive phone calls and, eventually, Chris Doyle's published article, which she read alone in her dorm room 3 times before calling her mother. The conversation that followed was not an easy one. Emily had grown up believing, the way most children believe the version of their parents' marriage presented to them, that her father was the driving force behind the family's success, and her mother was simply, gently, along for the ride. Rebuilding that understanding took months, not a single dramatic reconciliation but a slow accumulation of smaller honest conversations, Diane finally telling her daughter the real story of the 6 years of night classes, the grocery budget, the parking garage tears, and Emily, to her credit, listening all the way through without interrupting, and at the end of it simply asking her mother why she'd never told her any of it while it was happening. Diane's answer, when she finally gave it, was the truest thing she said in the entire story, because I wasn't sure yet that I'd earned the right to say it out loud. A year after the hearing, a local business journal ran a profile on Diane Hartwell, part of a feature on second acts and late career reinventions among Houston professionals. The photograph accompanying the article showed her standing in front of her small office, arms crossed, wearing the same navy suit she'd worn to court, smiling the kind of smile that belonged entirely to her. The reporter asked her, near the end of the interview, what she would say to women who felt invisible in their own homes, who felt their contributions went unseen and unspoken for years at a time. Diane thought about it for a long moment before answering. She said that invisibility sometimes isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the part where you're building something nobody else can see yet, and the only thing that matters is whether you keep building anyway, one quiet Tuesday at a time, for as long as it takes. Somewhere across town, in a rented condo with the television tuned low, Warren Hartwell watched the segment air on the local evening news and said nothing at all, because for the first time in his life, there was genuinely nothing left to say. He had spent 22 years believing he was the only person in that marriage capable of building something. It had taken a single Tuesday morning in courtroom 6C to teach him, far too late to change anything, that he had simply never once thought to ask what his wife had been building the whole time, quietly, patiently, in the years he never bothered to notice. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.